There is one battle in history, small in numbers but enormous in meaning. How could just a few hundred men shake the foundation of an empire? Stay with this story until the end, because the answer will not only surprise you, it may change the way you understand the very idea of bravery. The sun was setting over the mountains of Greece, casting a golden glow across the rugged land. In the distance, the small city-state of Sparta stood proud and firm, its walls reflecting the spirit of a people who valued discipline above all else. This was not just any place in ancient Greece. Sparta was different. While other cities celebrated art, music, and philosophy, Sparta raised its children to endure hardship, to obey, and to fight. Life in Sparta was strict, sometimes harsh, but it forged men and women who were unshakable in loyalty and courage. Our story begins here, in the year 480 BC, at a time when the world seemed to tremble beneath the march of one of the largest empires ever known, Persia. Led by King Xerxes, the Persian Empire stretched across continents, from the plains of Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean. Xerxes' dream was not only to rule Persia, but to bring the proud Greek city-states under his command. The Greeks, however, were fiercely independent. Athens treasured democracy and the arts. Corinth thrived on trade. Sparta stood as a symbol of strength and military order. Though they shared a culture, language, and gods, the Greeks were divided by rivalries and ambitions. To Xerxes, this division was an opportunity. With his massive army, tens of thousands of soldiers, supported by ships that filled the seas, he marched toward Greece, certain that no small collection of city-states could stand in his way. And yet, resistance stirred, for in the heart of Greece, leaders began to see that if Persia conquered one city, the rest would fall like dominoes. Among them was Leonidas, the Spartan king. Unlike other rulers, Leonidas did not seek glory for himself. His concern was for the survival of Greece, for the freedom of its people, and for the honor of Sparta. Leonidas knew the truth. The Persian army was too large to meet in open battle. Greece could not match its numbers. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was another way. To stop the Persians, the Greeks would need to choose their ground carefully, to fight not with numbers, but with strategy. It was then that the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was chosen. This was no ordinary battlefield. The pass was squeezed tightly between the steep cliffs of Mount Kallidromos and the waters of the Malian Gulf. Here, the massive Persian army would be forced into a narrow line, unable to use its overwhelming numbers all at once. To defend such a place, a small force might stand against a giant. But who would take on such a task? Who would risk certain death to delay an empire? Sparta answered the call. Leonidas, aware that the challenge was beyond hope of survival, gathered a select group of warriors. Only 300 Spartans would march with him, chosen not for their youth, but for their maturity. These were men who already had sons to inherit their names, men who had lived, loved, and could leave behind a legacy. Alongside them, other Greek allies would join, Thespians, Thebans, and more, each one aware that the mission was not to return home victorious, but to hold the pass for as long as possible. In the quiet of Sparta, as Leonidas prepared his men, the air was filled with both pride and sorrow. Wives watched their husbands polish their armor for the last time. Children clung to their fathers, not fully understanding why they must leave. The elders of Sparta looked on, silent and respectful, for they knew this march would be remembered long after their city was dust. Before they departed, Leonidas was said to have told his warriors, "Eat well, for tonight we dine in Hades." It was not a promise of defeat, but a reminder that their stand was about more than survival. It was about honor, freedom, and showing the world that even the mightiest empire could be challenged. As the small band of 300 prepared to leave, the entire city gathered to watch. No one wept openly. Spartan pride did not allow it. Instead, they stood tall, as if to tell their warriors, "Go, and show the world who we are." the march toward Thermopylae began. Along dusty roads and winding mountain paths, Leonidas and his men advanced steadily, their red cloaks flowing in the wind, their shields catching the last rays of the sun. They knew the Persian army would be unlike anything Greece had ever faced. Archers that darkened the skies with their arrows, cavalry that thundered across plains, and warriors from faraway lands, each carrying strange weapons and armor. Yet the Spartans did not fear. For them, fear was a luxury. Discipline, duty, and courage guided their steps. And so, with every stride, the stage was set. On one side, an empire vast enough to swallow nations whole. On the other, a small force led by a king who understood that sometimes the smallest flame can shine brightest in the darkest night. This was not just a march to war. It was the beginning of a story that would echo through centuries, a tale of defiance that would inspire generations yet unborn. The clash between Persia and Greece was near, and at its heart stood Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, ready to meet fate at the gates of fire. Long before King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans marched toward Thermopylae, the story of Greece and Persia had already been written in tension, rivalry, and fire. The struggle between the two worlds did not begin in a single moment. It was a chain of sparks that over years grew into a blaze. To understand the significance of Thermopylae, we must first step back to the earlier encounters between East and West. Nearly a decade before Leonidas rose to prominence, the first great Persian attempt to conquer Greece had ended in shock. This was the famous Battle of Marathon, fought in 490 BC. At that time, King Darius, father of Xerxes, sought to punish Athens for supporting rebellions against Persian rule in Asia Minor. Confident in his strength, Darius sent his soldiers across the Aegean Sea, believing the Greek defenders would crumble. But the Athenians stood firm. At Marathon, a much smaller Greek force launched a daring attack and drove the Persians back to their ships. It was a stunning victory, one that humiliated the mighty Persian Empire and echoed across the ancient world. From that day on, Greece became a thorn in Persia's pride. King Darius swore revenge, but time was not on his side. Before he could return with an even greater army, he passed away, leaving the unfinished task to his son, Xerxes first. Unlike his father, Xerxes dreamed not only of punishing Athens, but of bringing all of Greece under Persian control. His ambition was enormous, his resources seemingly limitless. For years, Persia prepared. Ships were built in vast numbers, forming what some described as a floating city upon the sea. Armies were gathered from across the empire's wide lands: Babylonians, Egyptians, Medes, Indians, and countless others, each bringing their own weapons and traditions of war. Ancient writers spoke of the Persian army as if it stretched from horizon to horizon, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Whether or not the numbers were exaggerated, there is no doubt that Xerxes commanded one of the largest forces the world had ever seen. Meanwhile, Greece remained divided. The city-states were proud of their independence, often quarreling with one another. Athens and Sparta, though powerful, distrusted each other. Smaller cities feared choosing the wrong side, for if Persia won, they risked destruction. Some even considered surrender, hoping to survive beneath Persian rule. Yet among these divisions, voices of unity began to rise. Leaders realized that if Persia conquered Greece, their culture, freedom, and way of life could vanish forever. The Greeks did not have the numbers to match Persia, but they had courage, knowledge of their land, and the spirit of independence. To organize their defense, many city-states formed an alliance under what became known as the Hellenic League. For the first time, Athens and Sparta stood together, putting aside their rivalries to face the greater threat. Athens would lead on the seas, with its growing navy, while Sparta, with its unmatched warriors, would command the defense on land. This was the world into which Leonidas stepped as king of Sparta. He was not a man who sought war, but he understood it was inevitable. The Persians would march, and Greece would need to answer. The question was, where could they make a stand? Geography gave them the answer. The Persians would likely enter Greece from the north, sweeping down through Thessaly and into the heartland. To stop them, the Greeks needed to find a place where their smaller forces could hold back the tide. All eyes turned to the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for its steaming springs. Here, the land pinched so tightly between mountains and sea that only a few warriors could stand side by side. Defending Thermopylae would mean more than just holding a line. It would buy time. Time for Athens to prepare its navy. Time for the rest of Greece to organize. Time for courage to grow in the hearts of people who feared the might of Persia. But there was a cost. Whoever defended Thermopylae would do so knowing they faced overwhelming odds, and that survival was unlikely. Leonidas, bound by duty and by Spartan tradition, stepped forward. His decision was not reckless pride, but cold calculation. He understood that a sacrifice was needed, and he was prepared to offer it. Selecting 300 of Sparta ECU's finest warriors, men with families who would carry on their names, Leonidas prepared to march north. Allies from other cities would join, but it was clear the stand at Thermopylae would not be about victory in numbers. It would be about showing Greece and the world that freedom was worth the highest price. Far away, in the palaces of Persia, Xerxes readied his grand army. He believed no force on earth could stand against him. Yet in the mountains of Greece a small flame of defiance had been lit. The stage was set. The empire of Persia, vast and unstoppable, would soon meet the united courage of Greece at a narrow pass where numbers meant little and resolve meant everything. Thermopylae awaited. The summer heat of 480 BC weighed heavily over Greece as two great forces moved toward one another. From the east came the Persians, a river of men and horses stretching farther than the eye could see. From the south and west, through valleys and mountain passes, came the Greeks, a far smaller force, steady in step and firm in purpose. Both marched toward the same destination, Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. For the Persians, the march was like a festival of empire. Soldiers wore many kinds of clothing and armor, their styles as varied as the lands they came from. Tall spearmen from Asia Minor, archers from the Far East, chariots rolling on wheels decorated with shining bronze, cavalrymen whose horses were adorned with bells and ribbons. Xerxes himself traveled with luxury and ceremony, carried in a chariot and attended by guards whose only duty was to protect his life. Ancient sources describe bridges built across the Hellespont, a marvel of engineering, so the Persian host could walk from Asia into Europe. Wherever they passed, the earth seemed to shake beneath their numbers. For the Greeks, the march was quieter, but no less purposeful. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans moved with discipline, their armor simple yet gleaming, their scarlet cloaks a symbol of defiance. Alongside them traveled allies, Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and others, fewer in number but equal in determination. Together they formed a force of several thousand, still only a fraction of what Persia would bring, but united in spirit. The road north was not only a journey of distance, but of reflection. Each man knew the odds. Some spoke little, keeping their thoughts hidden, while others whispered prayers to the gods of Olympus. Leonidas himself walked with calm dignity, offering words of encouragement. He reminded his men that they were not fighting for Sparta alone, but for all of Greece, for their families, their homes, and their way of life. At last, the two forces approached Thermopylae. The pass was exactly as the Greeks had imagined, narrow, steep, and treacherous, with mountains rising high on one side and the sea pressing close on the other. At its tightest point, no more than a few dozen men could stand shoulder to shoulder. Here, numbers would lose their advantage. Here, the courage of a few could hold back the many. The Greeks fortified their position. They repaired an old wall that once stood in the pass, strengthening it with wood and stone. Behind it, they prepared their shields and spears, knowing the Persians would soon arrive. Scouts were sent out to watch the horizon. And then they saw it. a dust cloud in the distance, rising like smoke above the earth. The ground trembled faintly. The Persians were near. Day by day, the massive host drew closer, until the sea itself seemed to fill with sails and the valleys with endless ranks of soldiers. For the first time, the small Greek force could truly see the scale of the empire they faced. To some, it must have felt like standing before a storm that could not be resisted. Yet the Spartans and their allies did not falter. Xerxes set up his camp not far from the pass, his pavilions richly decorated, his banners fluttering proudly. From his vantage point, he could see the narrow line of Greeks guarding the road. He must have wondered at their confidence. Why would so few men stand against his great army? Surely they would surrender or retreat when they realized the impossibility of their task. To test them, Xerxes sent messengers to Leonidas, demanding that the Greeks lay down their arms and submit. Leonidas' reply was simple, yet unforgettable. "Come and take them." These words carried across time, a declaration that freedom is never given up willingly. The Persians, taken aback by this defiance, hesitated. Xerxes delayed his assault, perhaps waiting for the Greeks to scatter, but the Greeks held their ground. Days passed, the standoff growing heavier with each sunrise. For the men in the pass, every moment was filled with suspense. They heard the distant sounds of the Persian camp, the neighing of horses, the clash of weapons, the music and drums that stirred the soldiers. Yet, within their narrow defenses, the Greeks remained calm. They trained, they sang, they prayed. To them, this was not merely waiting, it was preparing their hearts. Then the tension broke. Xerxes, angered by their refusal, ordered his soldiers to advance. From the Persian lines came the sound of horns and drums, echoing against the cliffs. The first waves of soldiers marched forward, filling the narrow road. Their banners rose high, their weapons gleamed under the sun. At Thermopylae, the Greeks braced themselves. Shields were lifted, spears were leveled, eyes were fixed on the advancing tide. Leonidas stood among them, calm and steadfast, a figure of courage. And so the battle at the gates of fire began, not with chaos but with the quiet resolve of men who knew what they faced and who chose to stand anyway. In every great story of history, there is a figure who stands at its center. At Thermopylae, that figure was King Leonidas of Sparta. Yet Leonidas was not a man who sought glory for its own sake. To understand his role, we must look beyond the armor and the crown, and into the heart of the man who became a symbol of courage. Leonidas was not born to be king. He was the third son of the royal line, a prince with little expectation of ruling. His older brothers stood ahead of him in the order of succession. This gave him a different path, one not shaped by privilege, but by discipline and humility. Like every Spartan boy, he endured the agog, the harsh training system that tested endurance, obedience, and skill from childhood. From an early age, Leonidas learned to live with less, to push through pain, and to place the needs of the community above his own desires. When fate eventually brought him to the throne, Leonidas was already shaped into something more than a ruler. He was a soldier king, respected not only for his title but for his ability to endure the same hardships as the men he commanded. He was not distant from his people. He was one of them, bound by the same laws and traditions. By the time Xerxes marched west, Leonidas was no longer a young man. He was seasoned, both in age and in wisdom. He knew the Persian threat was not something Sparta could ignore, yet he also understood the limits of what could be done. Greece was divided, Persia was overwhelming, and there was little time to unite the scattered city-states. Why, then, did Leonidas choose to lead 300 Spartans into what seemed like certain death? The answer lies in the balance between duty and hope. Leonidas was bound by the customs of Sparta. The city was preparing for a great religious festival, the Carneia, and by law, the Spartan army could not march in full until the sacred rites were complete. But waiting would allow the Persians to advance unchecked. If no one delayed them, Xerxes' forces would pour into Greece before the defenses were ready. Leonidas understood this better than anyone. If the Persians were to be held, even briefly, someone had to stand at Thermopylae. He knew it would not be enough to win the war, but it might buy the time needed for Greece to rally. Thus, he made his decision. He would go himself, not with the full Spartan army, but with a chosen 300. These men were not picked at random. Leonidas selected warriors who already had sons to carry on their names. In this way, the sacrifice of fathers would not erase their families from Sparta's lineage. It was a practical choice, yet also deeply human. As king, Leonidas could have ordered others to march in his place, but he did not. He chose to go with them, to share their fate, to stand not above them, but among them. His presence gave courage to the Greeks. If a king was willing to lay down his life, then no man could claim his duty was too heavy. And yet, though Leonidas wore the mantle of strength, he was still human. Ancient writers tell us little of his private emotions, but we can imagine the quiet weight he carried. He left behind his wife, Queen Gorgo, and his children. On the eve of departure, he must have looked upon them knowing that he would not return. His farewell was not a cry of despair, but a steady example of Spartan resolve. To his queen, he offered no empty comfort, only trust in her own strength. To his people, he gave the image of a leader who accepted his fate with dignity. At Thermopylae, Leonidas' role was not merely to command strategy. He was the heart of the defense. He walked among his soldiers, steadying their nerves, reminding them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. His words were few but powerful. To men who feared the endless waves of Persia, he offered calmness. To those who doubted, he offered certainty. In the eyes of his soldiers, Leonidas was more than a king. He was a father, a brother, a comrade. He stood in the line with them, shield to shield, spear in hand. He shared their meals, their songs, and their prayers. He did not ask of them what he himself would not do. This was the essence of Leonidas, a leader who ruled not through commands, but through example. His choice to stand at Thermopylae transformed him from a ruler of a single city into a symbol for all of Greece. For Leonidas, the stand was never about winning the battle. It was about showing that freedom could be defended, even in the face of impossible odds. It was about teaching the world that courage is not measured by survival, but by sacrifice. And so, at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, Leonidas took his place, not as a king above men, but as one of them. His crown was not of gold, but of honor, and it shone brightest when the night was darkest. When the dust settled at Thermopylae, the Persian army pressed onward into Greece. In a narrow sense, the defenders of the Hot Gates had been overcome. Yet, in the larger story of history, their sacrifice carried weight far greater than numbers or territory. What happened at Thermopylae sent ripples across Greece, Persia, and even the centuries that followed. The first and most immediate impact was time. By holding the Persians at the pass for days, Leonidas and his men had given Athens and the other Greek city-states precious moments to prepare. While the Spartans and their allies faced the storm, Athenian citizens evacuated their city, and their navy gathered strength for the battles to come. Without the delay at Thermopylae, the Persians might have swept into Greece before resistance could be organized. The second impact was unity. Before Thermopylae, the Greek city-states were fractious, often more likely to quarrel with each other than to stand together. Athens and Sparta distrusted one another. Smaller cities feared choosing sides. But the story of Leonidas and his 300 created a new spirit. People began to see themselves not merely as Athenians, Corinthians, or Spartans, but as Greeks united in a single struggle. The courage of the few became the banner under which the many could gather. Even among those who doubted, something shifted. The Persians were powerful, yes, but Thermopylae proved they could be resisted. It showed that bravery, strategy, and determination could hold back the largest empire the world had ever seen, if only for a time. In that delay, hope was born. For Persia, the consequences were different. Xerxes had won the pass, but not without surprise. His army, vast and mighty, had been checked by a handful of warriors for longer than he ever expected. What was meant to be an easy conquest was revealed as a campaign that would demand effort and patience. The myth of Persian invincibility was shaken. Beyond the battlefield, Thermopylae's impact grew in ways no soldier at the pass could have imagined. News of the stand spread across Greece, carried by travelers and storytellers. People spoke of Leonidas' defiance, of the 300 who marched knowing they would not return, of the allies who stood beside them. These stories did not fade. They multiplied, turning sacrifice into legend. In Sparta, the memory of the fallen became a source of pride. Families who had lost fathers and sons held their heads high, knowing their names would be honored for generations. For the widows and children left behind, sorrow was heavy, yet it was wrapped in dignity, for they were kin to heroes. In Athens, too, the story resonated. Though Spartans and Athenians were rivals, even enemies at times, the courage shown at Thermopylae inspired respect. It reminded them that their struggle was shared, and that freedom demanded sacrifice from all. The symbolic impact stretched further still. To the world beyond Greece, Thermopylae became a tale of the few standing against the many, of courage in the face of overwhelming force. It was not the size of the army that determined greatness, but the spirit within it. This idea would echo across time, inspiring countless others who faced seemingly impossible odds. But perhaps the deepest impact was not on politics or war, but on the human heart. Thermopylae reminded people that honor could outlast death, that a choice made in courage could echo longer than a life lived in fear. Leonidas and his men were gone, but their example lived on, shaping the choices of those who came after. In the days that followed, the Persians advanced. They would burn Athens, clash on the seas, and meet the Greeks again at Salamis and Plataea. But they could never erase what Thermopylae had given, the spark of defiance, the belief that even the greatest empire could be resisted. The hot gates were a narrow pass in the mountains, yet they opened a wide path in history. What began as a desperate stand became a turning point, not because it stopped an army, but because it awakened a spirit. And so, the world learned a lesson that still endures. Sometimes the greatest victories are not measured in territory won, but in the courage to resist when surrender seems the easier path. For days, the narrow pass of Thermopylae had echoed with the clash of determination. Again and again, the Persian waves had rolled forward, and again, the Greeks had held them back. The cliffs stood silent witnesses, the sea beside them carrying the sound of battle across the waters. The Persians could not understand it. How could so few stand against so many? Even Xerxes himself grew restless, watching as his vast army struggled to break through the thin line of defenders. His pride, once certain of easy victory, now felt the sting of doubt. Then came the turn of fate. A local man, seeking reward, revealed to Xerxes a hidden mountain path that wound around the cliffs. This narrow trail, scarcely known, led behind the Greek position. With it, the Persians could outflank the defenders, surrounding them from both sides. When word of this betrayal reached Leonidas, the truth settled heavily upon him. The pass could not be held any longer. The Persians would soon come from behind, and the defense would collapse. Yet in that dark moment, Leonidas made his choice. He did not retreat. He did not flee. Instead, he dismissed much of the Greek force, sending allies home so they might live to fight another day. Only a small band remained, his 300 Spartans, joined by loyal Thespians and Thebans, men who refused to abandon the stand. They would fight to the end, not for victory, but to leave behind a legacy of courage. The night before the final assault, the camp of Leonidas was strangely calm. The men spoke quietly, shared their last meals, and gazed at the stars above. Some prayed to the gods, others thought of their families, while others simply sat in silence. The Spartans, bound by tradition, are said to have combed their hair and polished their armor, as if preparing for a festival rather than their last day. It was not vanity. It was dignity. They wished to meet their fate with honor, their appearance a reflection of their spirit. At dawn, the Persians advanced from both sides. The earth shook with their numbers, the sky filled with the sound of horns and drums. Xerxes himself looked on, expecting this final surge to break the Greeks once and for all. But what he witnessed instead was astonishing. The small band of defenders did not crumble. They stood tall, their shields forming a wall of resolve, their spears leveled like the teeth of a single beast. Every step they gave was deliberate, measured, and defiant. Time slowed in that narrow pass. To the Greeks, every heartbeat was precious. Every moment gained a gift to those preparing far away. To the Persians, it must have seemed as though they were fighting not men, but legends come to life. Amid the chaos, Leonidas remained at the center, a beacon for his warriors. He did not command from afar. He stood among them, his presence steady, his voice calm. His men looked to him, and in his composure they found courage. As the Persians closed in, the defenders pressed together more tightly. The walls of the pass rang with the clash of shields, the shouts of men, the relentless push of empire against defiance. Yet even as the circle closed around them, the Greeks did not surrender. Their purpose was fulfilled, not in survival, but in the message they left behind. Finally, as the sun rose high above the mountains, the last defenders were overwhelmed. The pass fell silent, save for the wind that swept through the hot gates. Leonidas and his men were gone, but their stand had burned itself into the memory of all who witnessed it. From his throne, Xerxes looked down at the narrow road. He had won the pass, yes, but not the spirit of Greece. For in the act of resistance, the Greeks had transformed defeat into something greater. They had shown that courage could outlast conquest, that honor could outshine power. The climax of Thermopylae was not a victory of arms, but a triumph of spirit. In the face of overwhelming force, a few had chosen to stand, and in doing so, they created a story that would echo through eternity. When the dust settled at Thermopylae, the narrow pass lay in silence. The Persian army had marched through at last, their banners fluttering in the breeze, their drums echoing with triumph. But though they had cleared the path, the victory was far from complete, for in the hearts of the Greeks something far greater had been awakened. News of the stand at Thermopylae spread swiftly across the land. Farmers in their fields, merchants in their markets, sailors in their ports, all heard of how a few had faced many, how Leonidas and his companions had given their lives so that others might fight another day. Rather than breaking Greece, the fall of the hot gates ignited a fire of unity. States that had long quarreled among themselves began to look past their rivalries. Athens and Sparta, so often divided, now stood side by side, recognizing that only together could they resist the tide of Persia. Xerxes, confident in his numbers, pressed onward. His armies moved through Greece and his fleet sailed along the coast. Athens itself was abandoned by its people who sought refuge upon the sea. The city was left nearly empty, a sacrifice of stone so that its spirit might endure elsewhere. The Persian army entered the city, its temples and homes burned, the smoke rising as if in mourning. Yet even in loss, the Greeks were not defeated. The Athenians, guided by the wisdom of Themistocles, had taken to their ships. The narrow waters of Salamis became their new battlefield. There, with strategy as their weapon, they trapped the vast Persian fleet in straits too narrow for numbers to matter. Oars crashed, hulls splintered, and the fleet of Xerxes was thrown into disarray. From the sea to the land, the tide began to turn. Though Thermopylae had been lost, its lesson endured, that courage could buy time, and time could bring opportunity. The Persian king, unsettled by the growing resistance, eventually withdrew much of his force, leaving generals to continue a campaign that no longer carried his full confidence. As for Leonidas, his body was taken by the Persians, but his spirit belonged to Greece. Years later, his remains were returned to Sparta, where his people honored him not as one who had failed, but as one who had fulfilled the highest calling of a leader. To the Spartans, his name became a symbol. To the Greeks, his sacrifice was a story told across generations. And what of the allies who had stayed by his side? The Thespians, though fewer in number, were remembered for choosing to remain when they might have fled. Their devotion spoke of a loyalty as deep as any spear thrust. The Thebans, too, carried their complicated place in the tale, their fate bound forever to that final stand. The resolution of Thermopylae was not peace, it was preparation. The Persians still marched, their empire still vast, their ambitions still great. Yet the Greeks, though small in number, had proven that resistance was not only possible, but powerful. They had planted the seed of belief, and from that seed, victory could grow. In the months and years that followed, battles would rage across land and sea. Salamis, Plataea, Mycale. Each carried the echo of the hot gates, each touched by the memory of men who had chosen to stand when others might have turned away. The road beyond Thermopylae was uncertain, yet one truth had been made clear to all. A single moment of courage could ripple outward, reshaping the fate of nations. The story of Thermopylae did not end with the fall of a mountain pass. It lived on, carried across centuries, engraved not only in stone, but in the imagination of peoples far beyond Greece. Though empires rose and fell, though kingdoms changed their borders and their rulers, the tale of a few who stood against many remained a beacon. For the Spartans, Thermopylae became the purest reflection of their code: to live with discipline, to fight with honor, and to give all for the defense of their land. These were values they had always spoken of, but at Thermopylae they were proven in action. Leonidas was no longer merely a king, he was a legend, a standard by which future generations would measure courage. For the Greeks as a whole, the hot gates reminded them of the strength found in unity. Rival cities that often quarreled, Athens with its fleets, Sparta with its warriors, Thebes with its doubts, were bound together by the memory of men who had chosen to stand as one. That unity, fragile as it was, enabled Greece to withstand the storm of Persia and to preserve its independence. For the world beyond, Thermopylae became a story that transcended borders. Historians and poets carried it forward, artists painted its imagery, and leaders invoked its spirit. Across cultures, the message resonated, that courage, even when outnumbered, can leave an impact greater than numbers alone. At the site of the battle, a stone was raised in memory of the fallen. Upon it was carved an epitaph so simple yet so powerful that it still echoes today. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. These words did not glorify conquest. They did not speak of empire or wealth. They honored obedience, duty, and the willingness to stand firm even when defeat was certain. In them lies the heart of Thermopylae, the belief that meaning is not measured by survival alone, but by the values one upholds in the face of overwhelming challenge. Over time, countless battles would be fought, countless names remembered and forgotten. Yet Thermopylae remains, not as the story of a lost past, but as the symbol of defiance. It reminds us that the greatest victories are sometimes not those won on the field, but those won in spirit. Victories that inspire others to rise, to unite, and to carry forward the flame of resistance. And so, as history flows onward, the hot gates stand eternal in memory. Not as a narrow road between sea and mountain, but as a meeting place between human courage and the weight of destiny. Thermopylae whispers across time that one choice, made with conviction, can change how a people see themselves. That sacrifice, though heavy, can guard the freedom of generations yet to come. And that in every age when the odds seem impossible, there lies the chance for a stand that will never be forgotten. Thus ends the tale of Thermopylae. Not the end of a war, not the end of Greece, but the beginning of a legacy that still echoes today.